the 20 points, Vasantra's 20 points for dealing with states of overwhelm that you'll remember Taranita introduced last week. And I've got kind of two objectives in this talk. And the first is to bring us back again to this mandala of the spiritual faculties, this very, very important core advice about how to live our lives as Buddhist. And then to apply this to some of the advice about dealing with overwhelm, which is so kind of pertinent at this current time, and which I think if we really take it on board, can so effectively add to our tools for living a Buddhist life. And you'll remember that's our overarching theme this year. You know, important to remember, above all, Buddhism is very, very practical. And that's what tonight's offering will be, largely practical, I hope. So just to return to these 5 spiritual faculties, let's try and bring them back to mind again. I'm going to ask Louis to flash them up again. But, you know, what we're trying to do through these weeks and months is to try to internalize this map and sort of add it to our hard drive. You remember these 5 faculties: wisdom and faith in the middle there, and then at the top, virya, vigor, energy, and concentration, balancing that on the bottom, and in the center there, mindfulness. So I'm just going to ask you to leave those up for a second there, Louis, and talk about, you know, why are these so important? So here's Sangharakshita writing about them in What is the Dharma? That chapter 9 that we referred you to. So after talking about his experiences of visiting remote villages in India to teach the Dharma, you remember Sangharakshita was in India for a long time and traveled very widely, visiting villages in India to teach the Dharma, and how he encountered this sheer joy and enthusiasm and energy with which he was repeatedly met by people who, you know, were materially very, very, very poor. And often he says that they would run kilometers out from the village, really hungry to greet him, hungry for his arrival and his teachings, and greet him with clapping and drums and dancing, and so seemingly full of happiness despite their poverty. And he says in relation to this, and I'm quoting here, the 5 spiritual faculties, which kind of he's seeing so clearly in these people, should account in the end to spontaneous, enthusiastic engagement with life and the work of life in the fullest and deepest possible sense. So it seems to me that he's saying very, very clearly here that the spiritual life, properly lived, should be full of joy, you know. So you'll recall, mindfulness here in the middle is this balancing agent, and it's only through mindfulness that you can balance faith and wisdom, energy and meditative concentration. So to explain a bit more, if faith is not balanced by wisdom, it can become blind and a bit fanatical. But if wisdom is not balanced by faith, then it can become dry, intellectual and cold. And again, you know, if energy is not balanced by meditation, it can degrade into restlessness. And if meditation, concentration, is not balanced by vigor, it can degenerate into sloth and apathy. But in the case of mindfulness and awareness, there is no such danger. Mindfulness does not need to be balanced by anything. Mindfulness is itself the balancing agent. Okay, thank you, Louis. Thank you. So it's very important to remember that the effectiveness with which any spiritual faculty will operate will depend to a large degree on the way in which it's balanced by the others. Now, in our own culture, we're often educated to concentrate on and to develop our strengths in whatever sphere. You know, it could be academic, physical, could be psychological or emotional. But the teaching of the spiritual faculties in Buddhism is saying very clearly, yes, know your strengths, but also know your corresponding weaknesses. It's important to know what you haven't got as well as you know what you have got, and to attend to this. Find it out and bring it into awareness. Because mindfulness is pivotal to Buddhism, because balance is pivotal to Buddhism. We always talk about the middle way, and the spiritual life is the balanced life at the highest possible level and in the broadest possible sense. And again, that's a quote from Sangharakshita. If we're not trying to be balanced, then we're not practicing Buddhism. So being Buddhist means always trying not to slip into extremes, or rather to rise above the tendency to sort of slide to one extreme or to the other. It means finding the middle, the axis or the fulcrum. And to do that, we need to exercise mindfulness. So when it comes to being in states of overwhelm, we can kind of see immediately that one of the key ways in which these states come about is because we lose balanced perspective. We start seeing things from an extreme point of view. You know, stuff like the planet will never ever recover. There's nothing I can do in this situation. Nobody understands, or it's always going to be like this, that sort of stuff. And we enter into what Buddhism calls a state of horrified anxiety. I think this is such a strong phrase. A state of horrified anxiety in relation to what's happening in the world that can lead to us feeling powerless. So for a kickoff, I think it's very important to develop the capacity to mindfully notice when we're slipping into states of horrified anxiety, either the edges or deep into. It's such a good term to sum up how miserable and how disempowering this mental state can feel. So yeah, number one, learn to recognize when that's arising for us. Now, appreciating the desirability and the beauty of maintaining, of keeping a state of mindfulness, I think lies in understanding that it always comes from this place of balance. Because mindfulness immediately restores perspective by coming right back to the here and the now. And when we come back fully into the here and the now of the body, the feelings, the thoughts, and the awareness of the Dharma, and you'll remember from our course last year, these are the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Then we immediately calm ourselves, center and ground ourselves. And awareness settles on everything that's happening in the present. So past regrets and future fears recede, and our energies focus on this particular conversation, this task, this panorama, or this sensation. So lots and lots of people struggle to establish a routine meditation practice. And in my experience, most of them think that they're unique and that everybody else is sitting down experiencing bliss states all the time. Absolutely not the truth. People do struggle to set up meditation practices. And perhaps here it's helpful to remind ourselves that mindfulness and meditation are not quite the same. In other words, we can practice mindfulness at any time, anywhere, you know, when we're doing the washing up, when we're gardening, when we're painting, when we're sitting in a traffic jam. It doesn't need a set of conducive conditions to be able to set it up, which is rather more the case of meditation. with mindfulness, you just dive in wherever you are to focus on the breath or body sensations or sense impressions or whatever. What we're doing is just simply trying to come back and fully attend to whatever is happening at that moment. So in that respect, hugely accessible and immediate. Okay, so next thing I wanted to sort of talk about was, how do we know when we're in a state of mindfulness? Or rather, I don't know how you feel, but how do I know? And so I know that if I am in a state of mindfulness, then I do feel calmer, and I certainly feel happier, or at least more contented. I know other things, like I observe that time seems to expand. There seems to be plenty of it. I know that suddenly I'm actually enjoying, you know, like watching the bubbles in the washing up water, or that a phrase of music really touches me, or that I'll pause over reading a line of text, or something tastes nice, or I feel myself very, very fully present with whatever is going on. And for once, I don't want to be somewhere else. And I also know that things like tension in my back and my shoulders and hips ease. And because I'm a bit of an old bird, I tend to get quite a lot of joint pain. And I know from my practice of mindfulness that stress states, that charge states, will translate into experiences of pain and discomfort much, much more readily than if I am in a state of mindfulness, which is noticeably more comfortable and easier. And the other thing I know is that I'm conscious of energy is much lower down in my body. It's not head buzz. So mindfulness brings pleasure, most certainly, and even joy. And I think this is such an essential thing to remember, because in any kind of practice that we want to cultivate, if we're enjoying it, if it's bringing a degree of pleasure, it's going to be much, much more likely that we're going to be able to sustain it. So turning to Vasantra's 20 suggestions for dealing with overwhelm, we had the idea in the team that rather than just present these again as a list, we could kind of find a way into them via the faculties. And of course, we could come at every point that Vasantra makes, all 20, from every one of the 5 points of view of the spiritual faculties. So, for example, with point 2, which is do whatever you need to do to help you stay resourced and balanced. Now, we could come at that from the point of view of strengthening our faith and confidence, or from deepening wisdom and understanding, or from the point of view of working with energy or using meditation. So it's not that each point for dealing with overwhelm neatly corresponds with a particular faculty, not at all. On the other hand, some of the points very clearly correspond with aspects of particular faculties. So I've picked out a few to explore in particular in relation to mindfulness. And these, I have to say, are my choices. These are the ones that speak to me and which I personally find helpful. And we'll probably come back to these again in the following weeks from a different point of view. And we'll also be exploring the other points, of course. So the first one, and the one which I think is most important in my view, is point 4. And point 4 is make sure that you stay well grounded. So I've already touched on this. Because in challenging times, we can be tossed around, you know, a bit like waves in a storm or tree branches in a high wind. We can experience that state of turbulence. On the surface, it's turbulent. But we remember then that the ocean in its depths will be far more stable and calm, and the tree will be strongly rooted in the ground. And we know that in times of crisis, we're very drawn to people who remain calm and clear thinking and measured and not reactive. We're very strongly drawn to those qualities. And in writing that this afternoon, I suddenly what suddenly came to mind was an image of Chris Whitty, the guy who's been doing all the briefings on a daily basis. You know, I've been listening to him for the last year, and you have too, I'm sure. And I just thought, I don't think in all the interviews I've seen him do, I have seen him wobble or shake around or felt an emotional charge or felt unsure or untrusting of what he's saying. I know that when he speaks, I'll listen and I trust it. And I just think, I don't kind of love the guy. He's not particularly sort of attractive or charismatic as a personality, but there is something about him that has remained so stable, so open, so honest, so grounded in all his press briefings. I just thought he's probably a good example of somebody who does retain a state of mindfulness, and goodness knows he certainly had to, hasn't he? Now you compare that with Boris Johnson sort of jumping around in the centre of the screen and sort of taking, you know, very, very, very different impression. So, as I said, we're strongly drawn to those qualities. We can seek to cultivate them. So how do we do that? We take awareness down and down. We breathe into the lower belly, the feet, the legs, the pelvis. Lots of meditation teachers these days talking more and more about bringing the breath into the lower body. We can do body work. We can walk, run, yoga, qigong. And we can remember our aspiration to establish a stable meditation posture, how important that is, because the posture of the body mirrors and directly affects what's going on in the mind. And most of us will love that saying, you know, keep a body like a mountain, a heart like the ocean, and a mind like the sky. I love that. And I love that notion of a body like a mountain. Okay, so that's the first one, staying grounded. Now, the next one is number 1 in the list. And we've put a link up to the list. In case, I think we have put a link up to the list, I hope. The next one is be aware of how much you take in and what is disturbing. Now, our capacity for this might seem to have been pretty much limitless at the moment. But important here to remember that the aim of any news program, for example, is not just to pass on information, but to attract an audience. There will always be a hook. If we listen carefully and attentively, we will find that the news is absolutely chock-a-block with superlatives. You know, it's the highest rate, the coldest February since records began, the fewest hours before some vital deadline has to be achieved. You know, and sometimes I sort of think that some political commentators, far from all, but some, actually construct their offerings more like those kind of very suspenseful Hollywood trailer announcers, you know, who kind of give you a few lines about this upcoming movie, leading to something sort of sensational, suspenseful, building to a sort of crescendo designed to sort of leave you wringing your hands or breathless with anticipation, but charged. There's a lack of impartiality there. So what is the point in listening to the same bulletins 3 times a day? What point is there more in exposing ourselves to images, say, of acute suffering, of desecration, of misery, of despair? I mean, this is, I guess, you know, you can argue this one, but I personally feel, what is the point of looking at them over and over again? I know these, I've seen them. I am well capable of conjuring them again in my imagination. If I do not look again and again, it does not mean that I don't care or that I'm burying my head in the sand. It means that I'm protecting my own tender heart because I do care. And I'm respecting my mind's endless capacity for proliferation. And here the same goes for whatever we watch to entertain, in inverted commas, ourselves. You know, I firmly believe that if we watch gratuitous violence and depravity, it will always have an effect at some level. It may not be conscious, but it will have an effect. So that's the second one. A few more. I've chosen number 3. This is kind of related, and it's being mindful on social media, which is so very relevant for us today, because we're all learning very fast that communication on screen or in text is not the same as face-to-face. These exchanges can become tetchy, rapid, they can ignite in a way that can become overwhelming and distressing. Very often, time for careful reflection is just lost, it's abandoned. And with time for reflection, perspective is lost. We're believing in the superficial. We can so rapidly be pulled in and addicted and compelled and glued to in very little time at all. And turning it off seems to be such a big deal. What might I miss, kind of thing. And I myself, you know, in the past as a teacher, I was very critical of my students constantly being on the phone and being sort of stuck to it and glued to it. And yet in the last year, I've become more and more attached to my phone as well. What I would suggest is that it's really, really interesting to look at your reactions and your responses around when we're on our phones and when we're on the internet, and not to underestimate the stress that they can cause, that feeling that somehow if we turn it off, we're going to be missing something important. It's a very interesting practice to feel in to the effect of that. Number 9 in the list, which is our, 4th, is work in your sphere of influence. Work in your sphere of influence. And this is all about identifying and being mindful of the difference between 3 different spheres, I think. So I'll just sort of outline these for you, these 3 different spheres. Now, the first is our sphere of concern. The second is our sphere of influence. And the third is our sphere of control. I think this is such a profoundly helpful teaching myself. So, for example, if I'm a young mum, I will have all 3 of those in relation to taking care of my small child. But as a mature mum of 30-somethings, I still have a great deal of concern about my kids, probably as much in a way, but much, much less influence and absolutely no control. You know, that's out the window. Now, if you transfer this sort of formulation to things like climate change or to terrorism or the refugee crisis. So there may be very, very little that I can do about war in the Middle East, but I can use my concern to motivate me to teach people to meditate and cultivate loving kindness and non-violence. And perhaps this won't have an immediate direct effect, but it will definitely have a knock-on. And I simply don't know how far that will go. Because like Basantra, I strongly believe that sending out metta into the world will have an effect. I simply cannot know how much, but I can most certainly be left feeling that I've done my best, I've acted out of kindness, I've turned towards and not away. And when it comes to feeling into my sphere of control, that is how empowered I am to do things that will change things, I have to acknowledge the laws of conditionality, that everything arises in dependence on conditions, a vast network of conditions, and that I can never, ever be in control of everything. Anyway, a story which comes to mind in relation to this, well, it's not a story. Some years ago, I went round to the women's community for an evening with Daya Jyoti and Amrita Nadi, and I remember they showed a movie, and it was a movie about a group of Tibetan nuns. It was about nuns, Buddhist nuns, you know, rather unusually, as opposed to Buddhist monks. And I remember very clearly, you know, images in this wonderful little movie, I forget what it was called, of these nuns living high up on a mountain. And at one point in the story, they took us up away from the main monastery where the women were living and working in very, very tough conditions, right up high to this sort of elder statesman of the group, as it were, the elder, the ancient, she must have been 100, I don't know, she was very, very old. She was just living like a sort of hermit way up on the top of the mountain. And she's just sitting there with one of those Tibetan prayer wheels, just spinning it and intoning mantras all day long, or for as long as her energy would hold up. And the image of her was so strong, and the palpable effect that she had on the women around her. And the narrator was sort of explaining that, as far as she's concerned, this was the most profoundly useful and helpful practice she could possibly do for the world, that she was sending out prayers into the suffering world. It was very, very moving and, yeah, touching to see somebody so utterly convinced about the power of this practice. So number 11 kind of follows on from this, and this is working at the inner as well as the outer level, and remembering that if we can stay aware that work can be done both outside but also inside, then we can always stay empowered. I mean, again, another one that really deeply upsets me is this situation about Nazanin Radcliffe, who you will recall has just finished her sentence, but was immediately carted off back to court and has been charged again, and will very likely end up staying in prison. And ostensibly, the commentator I was listening to was saying, you know, the reason that this situation continues is that there's some outstanding amount of money that hasn't been paid to Iran by the British government, and poor Nazanin is just a pawn in the middle. And I get quite frustrated and distressed by this, because I've kind of come to the belief that the more attention we pay her in the media, the more we bring her into the spotlight, in a way, paradoxically, the more chance there is that they're going to hang on to her because she's got such a high profile. So I think, well, what can I do? Is it skillful to keep on signing petitions? I find it distressing and very frustrating. And this particular case just really, really gets me. But what I can do, I can quietly reflect and dwell and chant mantras and send her loving kindness. And there's a wonderful practice called Tonglen, a Tibetan practice, in which one imagines oneself breathing in darkness and suffering and breathing out light and comfort. And you can do it for yourself. You can do it for Nazanin, anybody or anything else. And it's a completely mindful, present practice that can be done at any time. So a little bit later on, I might just introduce us a shade to this practice, which can be learnt in 5 minutes, but practiced over lifetimes. Now, just one more, number 14, which is do your best to let go of hopes and fears about outcomes. And I so much think that so much of our overwhelm comes from wild imaginings about the future and endless retellings of the past, which often become distorted and veer away from the truth, if indeed there is any such thing as absolute truth. And we, all of us, are endlessly leaning into a future we simply cannot know, but which we often fear. And so, like, how many times in this recent pandemic did the modelers, the scientists, and the politicians get the predictions wrong, and the pundits and the journalists? How many times did I get it wrong? So, if it's taught me one thing, it's simply that I don't know. And this most recent lockdown really did leave me with a strong sense that I just have to get through today and let tomorrow take care of itself. Plans are just not an option. They're only just beginning to swim into view. But I found this strangely liberating and really not so bad for an aspiring Buddhist to just be nobody and go nowhere. And a very helpful saying that a friend once gave me here is that the best advice in the present moment is just do the next kind thing. I think this is really great advice. So this next kind of thing might be something as simple as sending a hello text message to a friend whom you know is struggling. You don't need to have a conversation. You just say, I'm thinking about you. You're in my ether. It might be doing something for yourself, making yourself a nice meal. It could be refilling the bird feeder or walking to the shops and taking the car. But whatever, it's just a good one. Write it out and put it on your fridge. And then at the point where you stand in the gap, where something opens up, where a choice between a reactive response and a creative response arises, bring it to mind. It's just good guidance. What's the next kind of thing? And I'm just going to conclude with, finally, with a word about joy and guilt. And I thought about including this, but I think it is important to include because it's my observation that in states of loss and grief, some people can sometimes say things like, I feel guilty because today I felt happy. You know, he's only just died. How can I be feeling happy? But I think that we can get very, very unhelpfully confused about this. And teachings around guilt in Buddhism are very, very interesting, especially when we sort of compare them up against the kind of Christian or Catholic interpretations of guilt. So put simply, if I see a news story about a small child who has drowned on the shore of a country that he travelled to for safety, how can I not feel deep, desperate sadness and despair? But if half an hour later, I'm laughing at my baby granddaughter's latest attempts to stand up, is that wrong? Because in our lives, joy and sadness are just threaded together. And I think we all need to look at our relationship with guilt. It's my subjective experience that people whom I know are most likely to overwhelm are very often people who care very, very, very deeply about issues like climate change and so forth, but can simultaneously experience great states of guilt. I must, I should, I ought to, I'm failing, and beat themselves up terribly. So what I'm just finishing on is just raising a question about this. Are you somebody who does guilt? Because I think we need to look at our relationships with guilt. What purpose does guilt serve? I would suggest that is it not better to act from a mindful, full, clear, accepting place of awareness rather than this sort of pernicious, eaten up feeling of being guilty?